In the suffocating heat of Binh Tre Province, South Vietnam, January 17, 1960, something unfolded that shattered the illusions of the most powerful armies on Earth. At dawn, 5,000 women seemed to rise straight from the swamps of the Mekong Delta, their silhouettes shimmering through the mist like revenants summoned from an ancient curse. They carried no modern weapons, only sharpened bamboo carved to resemble rifles. Yet the South Vietnamese soldiers, armed to the teeth with American firepower worth millions, abandoned their fortified posts in blind terror. They left behind their guns, their uniforms, their training, even their sanity. What they faced was not bullets, but something far more corrosive. They had stumbled into the opening act of a psychological war so devastating, so carefully engineered, that even today classified Pentagon files on those events remain sealed under the label too destabilizing for public release. The mastermind behind this impossible spectacle was not a general nor a shadowy foreign power. It was a woman, Nguyen Thi Dinh, her name spoken in whispers by men who had faced death without flinching, yet refused to utter hers aloud. American intelligence would come to describe her as the single most dangerous woman in Southeast Asia, a figure of such calculated terror that hardened veterans trembled at the memory of her strategies. And yet, outside of Vietnam, her story is barely mentioned. A deliberate erasure, carefully maintained by those who understood that some truths, once spoken aloud, cannot be contained. Before we descend into the labyrinth of manipulation, hallucination, and mind-breaking strategies Nguyen Thi Dinh unleashed, you must make a choice. Because what follows is not entertainment. It is a transmission of forbidden history, the kind that governments bury and families dare not retell. If you are willing to walk deeper with me, type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments to seal this knowledge within you. And while you are here, subscribe to this channel. Let us know in the comments what city, state, or country you are listening from. Because every one of you, scattered across this world, is about to become part of a brotherhood that knows truths most will never dare to touch. What Nguyen Dinh created in 1960 was not simply war. It was the weaponization of perception itself, a doctrine that turned fear into a contagion. And once it infected the minds of soldiers, there was no cure. The Mekong Delta in 1960 was a place that swallowed armies whole. A landscape designed not for war, but for madness. Rivers twisted through endless rice paddies, their surfaces glimmering like shards of broken glass beneath the suffocating humidity. Coconut groves rose in dense, impenetrable walls, while the air itself hung thick with the dual stench of rotting vegetation and fear. It was here, in this natural labyrinth, that Nguyen Thi Dinh's revolution took root. A revolution not fought with guns, but with the human mind as its battlefield. Binh Tre was known as the land of coconuts, its 800 Zarazan villagers trapped between forces they barely understood. Colonial remnants, corrupt officials, and foreign armies who saw them as pawns on a geopolitical chessboard. But Nguyen Thi Dinh saw something different. Where others saw villagers caught in the crossfire, she saw an ocean of untapped power. Women whose grief, endurance, and fury could be transformed into a weapon sharper than any blade. She did not build her army in barracks. She built it in the kitchens, the rice fields, and the morning rituals of the Delta. Her genius was simple and terrifying. She understood that the true battlefield of Vietnam was never its jungles or rice paddies. It was the fragile boundary between perception and reality, and she had spent decades learning how to rupture it. Born in 1920, the youngest daughter of a poor farming family, Nguyen Thi Dinh's earliest memories were not of games or festivals, but of public executions staged by French colonial rulers. She saw neighbors tied to poles and dismembered before crowds, their screams echoing across the paddies. But while most children turned away in horror, she studied the French officers. She noticed the way they controlled the audience's reactions, how each lash of the whip was timed for maximum psychological impact. She realized that terror was not simply inflicted, it was orchestrated like a performance. This realization lodged deep inside her young mind. By 16, she already understood what generals and ministers would never admit: fear was not random. Fear followed patterns, and those patterns could be manipulated with scientific precision. Trauma was not chaos. Trauma was order, a virus that spread invisibly, replicating across families, villages, entire provinces. And she vowed to master it. When her first husband was arrested, tortured, and killed by colonial police, Nguyen Thi Dinh was transformed forever. She did not break. She became something else, a woman who would dedicate her life to perfecting the art of psychological warfare. A woman who would turn suffering into strategy. A woman who would make empires tremble. By 1940, Nguyen Thi Dinh's defiance had already placed her on the French blacklist. Arrest came not as a surprise, but as a calculated inevitability. When colonial officers dragged her from her home, binding her wrists and parading her through the village, they believed they were breaking a rebel spirit. They could not have known they were feeding it. The prison in Tho was a world carved from stone and silence. Its corridors reeked of sweat, mildew, and blood, a place where screams were muffled not to protect the prisoners but to remind them that no one outside would ever hear. Torture was routine, almost bureaucratic. Women were hung from beams, their bodies beaten until they swayed like pendulums. Men had their fingernails ripped out, their screams echoing against walls that had absorbed generations of human despair. Nguyen Thi Dinh endured this not as a victim, but as a student. Each blow, each humiliation was a lesson. She studied how her fellow prisoners cracked under pressure. She memorized the sequence, first the trembling hands, then the downward gaze, then the collapse into tears. She saw how the guards fed off despair, how their cruelty deepened when they sensed weakness. And most of all, she noticed that suffering did not affect everyone the same way. Some collapsed, others adapted. A select few became something unrecognizable, beings who had learned to separate body from mind. It was here, in those underground cells, that Nguyen Thi Dinh began assembling what she would later call her silent army. She whispered to the women at night, teaching them how to endure pain without granting their captors the pleasure of reaction. She instructed them to breathe in unison, to fall into rhythms that made their minds drift beyond the reach of agony. Guards grew frustrated when lashes no longer drew screams. They began to fear these women who would not break. Her insight was terrifyingly simple. Pain could be weaponized, not by inflicting it, but by mastering it. If a human being could endure torture without collapse, she could endure hunger, fatigue, and endless war. She could become the perfect revolutionary soldier. When Nguyen Thi Dinh was finally released, she did not leave prison as the same woman. She left as an architect of human endurance. She carried with her not just scars, but a blueprint, the understanding that trauma was not merely a wound. Trauma was an initiation, and as she walked back into the Mekong Delta's humid embrace, she knew the next phase of her life would not be about surviving terror. It would be about creating it, systematically, scientifically, and with a precision that no foreign army could ever anticipate. The villages of Binh Tre had always whispered of ghosts, spirits that lingered in the mangroves, the cries of ancestors carried by the river winds. But when Nguyen Thi Dinh returned from prison, the ghosts began to take human form. She moved quietly through the hamlets, gathering women not in temples or halls, but in kitchens, by riversides, and in the fields where they bent over rice stalks. There, in the everyday rhythm of labor, she began to plant the seeds of something the world had never seen: an army of women whose weapon was not just the rifle, but the human psyche itself. They called themselves the Weaponized, the long-haired army. At first, outsiders laughed at the name. What threat could barefoot women with flowing hair pose to foreign soldiers armed with machine guns and helicopters? But Nguyen Thi Dinh knew the truth. A weapon does not need to kill to win a war. It only needs to make the enemy lose their will to fight. The training was brutal, but not in the way the men's militias understood it. These women were not drilled for physical strength alone. They were drilled for psychological endurance. Nguyen Thi Dinh forced them to relive humiliation, to be screamed at, mocked, even spat upon, until they could stand unshaken, their eyes locked in silence. She staged mock interrogations where guards tried to break them with threats and cruelty, teaching them to respond not with fear, but with eerie calm. Every session was a rehearsal for war, not a war of bullets, but a war of minds. Soon, entire battalions of women could march directly into enemy lines without raising a hand, their chanting voices resonating like an ancient curse. Soldiers, trained to expect gunfire, were instead confronted with rows of women screaming not in terror, but in defiance, pounding drums, wailing funeral songs, and cutting through the air with the sound of grief sharpened into a weapon. Many men dropped their rifles, not from cowardice, but from disorientation. They did not know how to fight enemies who refused to act like enemies. But Nguyen Thi Dinh's genius did not stop there. She engineered spectacles designed to fracture the minds of her opponents. Entire villages staged fake funerals for soldiers still alive, forcing occupying troops to watch their own deaths performed in grotesque ritual. Children carried coffins through rice fields, their voices chanting dirges that echoed into the jungle. And everywhere, the sight of women, unarmed, unflinching, unbreakable, became more terrifying than the sound of gunfire. This was the doctrine Nguyen Thi Dinh had crafted from pain. Terror was not merely about killing. Terror was about rewriting reality. And with each action of the long-haired army, the line between resistance and theater blurred until her enemies no longer knew where the battlefield truly was. By 1960, Binh Tre was no longer a land of coconuts. It was a laboratory of psychological warfare, and Nguyen Thi Dinh, a farmer's daughter turned strategist of fear, had become its undisputed architect. By 1960, whispers of the long-haired army had spread beyond Binh Tre, slithering into the ears of generals, diplomats, and foreign intelligence officers. Reports arrived on American desks describing something that seemed impossible: unarmed women, barefoot and clothed in simple black garments, dismantling entire platoons without firing a single bullet. The documents did not read like military reports. They read like accounts of hauntings. Soldiers wrote of staring into the faces of chanting women and feeling their will collapse. Officers reported their men waking at night, drenched in sweat, hearing phantom voices of women wailing outside the barracks. The Americans dismissed these stories at first, until their own units began to fracture. Soldiers stationed in the Mekong Delta refused to patrol after sundown, claiming the villages themselves had turned hostile. They described funeral processions that appeared and vanished in the mist. They spoke of women walking silently through the jungle at night, their long hair glistening like rivers of black oil, their eyes fixed, unblinking. The line between superstition and strategy blurred so completely that even hardened commanders began to doubt their senses. Nguyen Thi Dinh had achieved what no weapon could. She turned the enemy's mind into its own battlefield. Her genius was in understanding that trauma multiplied faster than bullets. A single ambush killed 10 men, but a single spectacle of women marching unarmed into gunfire refusing to break, that image infected thousands. It lived in the memories of survivors, metastasizing in nightmares, eroding morale far beyond the battlefield. Foreign analysts began to study her with both fascination and dread. CIA psychological units pored over her methods, scribbling notes on the mechanics of mass influence, crowd manipulation, and what they termed reverse terror. But what they could never reproduce was her context. The way she drew power from cultural memory, from ancestral mourning, from centuries of colonial suffering. To the villagers of Binh Tre, she was not just a commander. She was an avatar of vengeance, a living embodiment of grief transmuted into defiance. Yet even as her tactics spread, Nguyen Thi Dinh remained unseen. She rarely appeared in photographs, avoided public recognition, and rejected personal glory. This anonymity was strategic. To her followers, she was everywhere and nowhere, a force more than a person. To her enemies, she was a rumor too vast to kill. By the end of 1960, the Mekong Delta was no longer a contested region. It was a theater of psychological domination. Foreign powers brought weapons, helicopters, napalm, but Nguyen Thi Dinh brought something far older, far more corrosive, the mastery of human fear itself. And in that war, she was already winning. By 1961, Nguyen Thi Dinh's doctrine had spread like wildfire. Villages across South Vietnam were no longer passive landscapes of suffering. They were psychological fortresses. Each hamlet, each rice paddy, each marketplace became a stage upon which she orchestrated performances of resistance. And in those performances, the boundary between ritual and war dissolved. The long-haired army grew from hundreds to thousands. Women who had once been confined to kitchens and fields now moved as disciplined battalions, their black clothing blending with the soil, their chants resonating like ancient incantations. They did not simply fight. They inverted the meaning of combat itself. When soldiers entered their villages, the women did not flee. They surrounded them. They sang. They wept. They cursed. And then, in orchestrated unison, they would fall to the ground, feigning death, creating a landscape of corpses that forced invaders to walk through the illusion of their own massacre. This was not just defiance. It was theater weaponized into warfare. Nguyen Thi Dinh had created a new language of conflict, one in which symbols, not bullets, were the ammunition. And the effect was catastrophic. Soldiers trained in conventional battlefields now faced an enemy that existed everywhere and nowhere, a hydra of grief and fury. Reports from American advisors describe scenes that read more like nightmares than engagements. One captain wrote, "We fired warning shots, and they did not move. We shouted commands, and they began to laugh. When we advanced, they started wailing, not like villagers, but like banshees. My men froze. Some dropped their rifles. I felt my own chest tighten as though I were the enemy, as though they had already buried me." This was the essence of Nguyen Thi Dinh's philosophy: control perception, and you control the war. A bullet killed a body, but fear, properly engineered, properly staged, killed entire units, entire strategies, entire nations. And behind it all, Nguyen Thi Dinh remained a ghost in the machinery. She moved through villages at night, speaking softly, always reminding her women that they were more than soldiers. They were symbols. They were the visible scars of Vietnam's centuries of suffering. And because they represented suffering itself, they could not be erased. By now, foreign powers began to realize the truth. They were not fighting guerrillas. They were fighting psychology, ritual, and myth fused into a single doctrine. A doctrine birthed in the prisons of Tho, sharpened in the grief of widows, and now unleashed across the Mekong Delta with terrifying precision. The war was no longer about land. It was about reality itself, and Nguyen Thi Dinh was rewriting it by 1962. Foreign intelligence agencies began to understand that Nguyen Thi Dinh was not simply leading a women's militia. She was engineering a new form of war, one so insidious, so immaterial, that conventional strategy dissolved against it. The CIA and South Vietnamese secret police launched counter-operations designed not to kill bodies, but to reclaim the battlefield of perception. They distributed propaganda leaflets, staged fake village ceremonies, and spread rumors that Nguyen Thi Dinh had been captured or executed. But the problem was simple and devastating. She had already anticipated this. Nguyen Thi Dinh had built her movement not around herself, but around an idea so resilient it could not be assassinated. Her very absence was her greatest weapon. The fewer photographs that existed of her, the less she appeared in public, the more her legend expanded. When leaflets claimed she was dead, villagers erupted in laughter. If she were dead, why did her shadow still walk at night? If the enemy announced her capture, women would march the next day by the hundreds, chanting her name, proving that no prison could contain her. Her counter to propaganda was not rebuttal. It was escalation. She instructed her women to turn every lie into theater. If the leaflets claimed she was executed, they would stage funerals. Not of her, but of American soldiers. Coffins were paraded through villages, marked not with names, but with the stars and stripes. If officials spread word of her disappearance, her followers staged ceremonies where little girls, dressed in black, appeared as Nguyen Thi Dinh reborn, declaring that as long as there were daughters, she would never vanish. In this way, she transformed the enemy's psychological campaign into fuel for her own. Every attempt to erase her only magnified her. Every rumor meant to demoralize instead tightened her grip on reality. And it was here that she revealed the second blade of her doctrine, the weaponization not just of grief, but of hope. Nguyen Thi Dinh understood that despair could paralyze armies, but hope laced with myth, sharpened with ritual, could make ordinary villagers indestructible. Her speeches were not fiery manifestos, but quiet promises whispered in the dark. We have already suffered everything they can do to us. What else remains? Only freedom. Villagers began to believe that survival itself was proof of victory. Children, barely old enough to walk, carried messages through jungles under the belief that no bullet could touch them. Widows who had buried their husbands declared that grief had made them invincible. And soldiers, watching this unbreakable spirit grow, began to fracture. For how do you fight an enemy that not only refuses to die, but grows stronger with every wound you inflict? Foreign commanders measured success in body counts. Nguyen Thi Dinh measured it in belief, and belief, once ignited, could not be extinguished by gunfire. By 1963, Nguyen Thi Dinh's shadow no longer belonged to Vietnam alone. Her methods, whispered through the Delta, carried by defectors, dissected in classified reports, began to ripple outward into a world already trembling on the edge of revolution. Havana, Algiers, Cairo, even Paris. Intellectuals and insurgents alike spoke of a mysterious woman who had turned grief into a weapon and women into an army that defeated fear itself. To the French, who had once chained her in the prisons of Tho, she became an unspoken humiliation. They had left Vietnam convinced they had faced peasants with rifles. Now they realized they had been dismantled by an architect of psychology. To the Americans, she was a puzzle that refused to fit into any known doctrine. Their generals spoke of guerrilla warfare, of hearts and minds, of counterinsurgency manuals, yet none of it explained how unarmed women could walk into gunfire, chanting, and come out the victors. But to the oppressed of the world, Nguyen Thi Dinh was something more. She was proof. Proof that the battlefield was not defined by tanks and jets, but by the human mind. Proof that even the poorest farmer's widow could bend in an empire if she understood the science of fear and the ritual of hope. Revolutionaries in Latin America studied her long-haired army as a model for mobilizing peasants. In Africa, whispers of her tactics seeped into movements resisting colonial powers. Even in Europe, students marching in 1968 carried fragments of her philosophy, though most never knew her name. For every headline that ignored her, her legend grew in the shadows. But with global influence came new dangers. Foreign intelligence agencies escalated their efforts, now not just to suppress her, but to understand her. Psychological divisions in Washington dissected her speeches, searching for patterns. French military schools quietly incorporated lessons from Ben Tray into counterinsurgency lectures. And deep inside Langley, the CIA began classifying her not as a guerrilla, but as a specialist in cognitive disruption. Still, she remained untouchable. No photograph, no confirmed location, no traceable command structure. She was a ghost, a doctrine, a ritual in motion. And this invisibility was her strongest armor. To kill her, they would have to kill the very idea of her. And by now that idea had spread far beyond their reach. For Nguyen Thi Dinh, the war in Vietnam was never just Vietnam's war. It was the proving ground for something larger, a revelation that trauma properly harnessed was more devastating than any bomb. And as the Mekong Delta burned under foreign fire, she smiled in silence. Because she knew what her enemies had not yet understood. They could scorch the earth, but they could not erase belief. And belief, once weaponized, was the most dangerous contagion in human history. By 1965, the Vietnam War had escalated into a firestorm. American troops poured into the Mekong Delta by the tens of thousands, armed with helicopters, napalm, and an industrial arsenal designed to scorch entire provinces into submission. Villages were bombed to ash, rivers clogged with corpses, forests burned until only skeletal trunks remained. And yet, even in this inferno, Nguyen Thi Dinh's shadow doctrine thrived. The long-haired army did not retreat in the face of overwhelming firepower. They adapted. When villages were razed, they turned ruins into altars, conducting funerals not for the dead, but for the occupiers who would follow. When helicopters thundered overhead, they staged mock rituals, raising their hands toward the sky as if summoning ancestral spirits to curse the machines. The spectacle unnerved even the most hardened soldiers. A gunfight was expected. A battlefield transformed into a theater of curses was not. Reports from the front grew increasingly unhinged. American units described walking into hamlets where every wall was painted with blood-red symbols, where effigies of soldiers hung from coconut trees, swaying in the humid breeze. Some troops claimed to hear voices at night, women chanting just beyond the wire, their tones so low and rhythmic that sleep became impossible. Entire platoons began to collapse into exhaustion, not from battle, but from the erosion of their minds. The generals, trained in metrics and maps, could not quantify what was happening. They measured progress in villages, secured, in bodies counted, in bombs dropped. But Nguyen Thi Dinh measured progress in fractures, in the quiet shattering of morale, in the doubt creeping through the minds of foreign troops who no longer knew if they were fighting villagers or specters. And perhaps most devastating of all, She understood that the war was not only being fought in the jungles, but on television screens in the United States. Each image of women confronting soldiers unarmed, each funeral procession caught on camera, carried her doctrine directly into American living rooms. Mothers watching in Ohio, Kansas, and California saw reflections of their own children in the faces of Vietnamese widows and daughters. Doubt spread across oceans. Nguyen Thi Dinh had weaponized not just the battlefield, but the very perception of the war itself. By the mid-1960s, US commanders were forced to admit privately what they could never say publicly. This was not a war, they understood. They could destroy villages, burn forests, and fill graves. But every act of violence only fed the ritual Nguyen Thi Dinh had perfected. Every bomb became a sacrifice. Every death became a symbol. And every attempt to kill her movement only made it stronger. She had turned Vietnam into a mirror in which empires saw not their victories, but their own unraveling. By 1968, the world would finally see the face of Nguyen Thi Dinh's war. For years, she had been a whisper, a shadow, a ghost directing armies from the mangroves of the Mekong. But when the Tet Offensive erupted, the mask was torn away. Suddenly, her doctrine of psychological disruption was no longer confined to hidden villages. It thundered through the streets of Saigon Ho and across every battlefield in Vietnam. Tet was not simply an offensive. It was theater on a planetary scale. While generals in Washington had promised the war was nearly won, Nguyen Thi Dinh and her comrades orchestrated a spectacle of simultaneous uprisings that shattered the illusion. Cities once thought secure exploded in fire. American embassies, bases, and strongholds were attacked in scenes broadcast across the world. For the first time, millions watched live images of American power being humiliated, not by armies equal in strength, but by villagers, students, and women wielding rifles and banners with equal ferocity. And at the heart of this chaos, Nguyen Thi Dinh's fingerprints were unmistakable. In Binh Tre, where her long-haired army had first risen, women staged demonstrations even as artillery thundered around them. They carried coffins into the streets, chanting not only for their dead but for the death of empires. The image of unarmed women standing before tanks, their long hair whipping in the smoke-filled air, spread across newspapers like a curse that no government could contain. Tet was a military gamble, and in many regions it cost lives without securing land. But Nguyen Thi Dinh had never measured war in land. She measured it in perception. And in that measure, Tet was a victory so complete it broke the spine of American confidence. The myth of inevitable US triumph collapsed overnight. Soldiers in the field asked why they were bleeding for villages that seemed to rise again, no matter how many times they were burned. Citizens at home questioned whether their sons were being fed into a war that could not be won. Nguyen Thi Dinh had taken her doctrine to its highest form. She weaponized visibility itself. What began as whispers in the Mekong Delta now echoed across television screens in New York, Paris, and London. The war was no longer about numbers or maps. It was about images, symbols, belief, and she controlled all three. For the first time, her name began appearing in foreign reports, not as rumor but as fact. Nguyen Thi Dinh, the commander of women, the architect of psychological warfare, the woman who had turned grief into an army. Yet even as her legend grew, she remained elusive, never basking in recognition, never stepping fully into the light, because she knew what her enemies still did not. Legends are far more dangerous than leaders. Leaders can be killed. Legends cannot. By the end of 1968, the Tet Offensive had burned itself into history. To Washington, it was a military disaster disguised as victory. To Saigon, it was proof of vulnerability. But to Nguyen Thi Dinh, it was the culmination of decades of invisible labor, proof that belief, once ignited, could topple an empire. And the world, watching in horror and awe, began to understand this war was no longer just about Vietnam. It was about the very architecture of power itself. The smoke of the Tet Offensive had barely cleared before its true devastation became visible. Not in villages reduced to rubble, not in casualty counts, but in the minds of those who had once believed in the inevitability of American victory. The battlefield had shifted. It no longer lived in the rice paddies or city streets. It lived in Washington, in Saigon, and in every living room where television screens flickered with images of chaos. Generals tried to frame Tet as a military disaster for the revolutionaries, claiming that tens of thousands had been lost. But Nguyen Thi Dinh had never measured success in numbers of dead. Her calculus was colder, deeper had the enemy's certainty been broken. Were there people questioning the war itself? If so, then every grave was not a defeat. It was an investment in doubt, in collapse, in the erosion of will. In the United States, protests swelled. College students, mothers, and veterans returning from battle carried signs declaring the war unwinnable. Politicians whispered in private that Tet had gutted the nation's spirit. Even the president, once confident in total victory, now wavered. A superpower had been shaken not by firepower, but by spectacle, by the psychological precision of a woman who had turned funeral processions into strategy. And outside Vietnam, her legend became contagious. In Latin America, guerrilla leaders studied her doctrine with fascination. In Africa, movements fighting colonial remnants began to ask not how many soldiers they could arm, but how many symbols they could stage. Even in Europe, radicals invoked the vision of women marching unarmed into machine guns and surviving as proof that power itself was vulnerable. Intelligence agencies scrambled to adapt. The CIA commissioned reports on psychological insurgency, dissecting Nguyen Thi Dinh's methods like surgeons studying a corpse. They wrote of symbolic inversion, of weaponized mourning, of ritualized resistance. But no matter how clinical the language, the truth unnerved them. She had mastered something they could not quantify. Fear, grief, and hope had no metrics. They could not be counted like bombs or bullets, and that made them uncontrollable. Meanwhile, Nguyen Thi Dinh remained in the shadows. She issued no grand proclamations, no manifestos of victory. She let others speak her name, while she slipped back into the rhythms of the Delta, organizing, whispering, teaching. Because she understood a truth that empires never grasp. The more you chase a shadow, the more it multiplies. By 1970, the war in Vietnam was no longer about who controlled which province. It was about who controlled belief. And belief, corrosive, viral, eternal, was something Nguyen Thi Dinh had long ago learned to command. By the dawn of the 1970s, Nguyen Thi Dinh was no longer merely a commander in the Mekong Delta. She had become a myth, a living riddle that both allies and enemies struggled to define. To the revolutionaries, she was the mother of the South, a strategist whose grief, forged tactics, kept entire communities alive. To foreign observers, she was something darker, proof that the battlefield had slipped beyond the reach of tanks and planes. In hidden war rooms across Washington and Saigon, her name surfaced again and again, spoken with an unease that generals reserved only for forces they could not predict. They had dossiers thick with photographs, intercepted letters, and witness accounts, yet each detail only deepened the puzzle. Was she a singular genius, or merely the vessel of something older? A force drawn from centuries of Vietnamese resistance against invaders. The CIA tried to box her into categories: insurgent, agitator, propagandist. But she defied all of them. She was not just a leader of fighters, she was the architect of belief. Across Vietnam, her presence was felt even when she was absent. Villagers swore that her footsteps lingered in the mud after she had gone, that her voice carried across rivers long after she had spoken. Mothers told their children stories of the woman who turned funerals into banners of defiance, who stood in front of guns and dared them to fire. And in the quiet of the night, even hardened soldiers admitted they fought harder simply because they thought she might be watching. Her influence stretched far beyond Vietnam. Revolutionaries in Latin America invoked her as proof that women were not merely participants, but vanguards of struggle. In the jungles of Angola and Mozambique, whispers of her tactics filtered through training camps, where guerrillas rehearsed not just ambushes, but staged rituals of resistance meant to fracture the psychology of their enemies. Even in the West, radicals studying her methods discovered a terrifying template. It was not brute strength that toppled empires, but patience. Not mass violence, but the calculated theater of suffering turned into weaponry. The Pentagon's machines could crush bodies, but they could not crush meaning. And Nguyen Thi Dinh trafficked in meaning. By then, intelligence reports began describing her not in terms of military rank, but as a psychological strategist of the highest order. They spoke of her ability to orchestrate silence, to bend grief into banners, to make despair itself march like an army. For the world's most powerful nations, this was the true nightmare, a woman who had turned the very act of endurance into a weapon sharper than any blade. And while her enemies labored to decode her, Nguyen Thi Dinh remained calm, quiet, unseen. Because she knew the secret that they did not once believe had taken root, it could not be killed. You could burn villages, level cities, poison jungles with chemicals, but once people had seen themselves capable of defying the impossible, they would never unsee it. Her shadow had already crossed oceans, embedding itself in the dreams of the oppressed and the nightmares of the powerful. And the war itself was no longer a war of land. It was a war of memory, and she had already won. By 1972, the war was unraveling. The great machine of American power, once so confident in its invincibility, staggered under the weight of exhaustion. Soldiers rotated home broken, haunted not by battlefield defeat, but by the gnawing sense that they had fought against ghosts. And at the center of those ghosts stood the legend of Nguyen Thi Dinh. Her name became shorthand among American troops for an unseen hand shaping the chaos. Some swore they had faced her directly in the Delta, though no two stories ever matched. To the superstitious, she was more spirit than soldier. An eternal presence in the mangroves, a whisper that turned villages against them before a shot was fired. To officers, she was a tactical headache, proof that their maps and metrics could not measure the intangible. To the Vietnamese, she was a reminder that survival itself was a form of defiance. The final campaigns grew desperate. Washington launched bombings of staggering intensity, raining fire over the north and flattening cities in hopes of breaking will. Yet Nguyen Thi Dinh had already understood the deeper truth: bombs could incinerate bodies, but they could not incinerate memory. Every blast only deepened the narrative. The empire had grown so afraid of women and children with banners that it was willing to set the sky on fire. And the women she had trained, the armies of peasants she had raised, did not stop. They carried her methods into the crumbling months of the conflict. Some organized silent marches through villages still smoking from napalm. Others stood in the rubble of temples, offering flowers to the dead in ceremonies designed not for mourning, but for defiance. Soldiers watching from the other side of the wire often admitted that such displays unnerved them more than gunfire. A bullet could be explained, but the willingness to suffer without breaking, that was an abyss too deep to comprehend. By 1973, the peace talks in Paris began, and the Americans sought their way out. They came not because they were beaten on the battlefield, but because belief had slipped away. The soldiers no longer believed in victory. The public no longer believed in the mission. The politicians no longer believed in the cost. And as the United States retreated, Nguyen Thi Dinh remained where she had always been. Not in the spotlight, not claiming triumph, but in the villages among the women, in the quiet work of tending both memory and rebellion. Because she understood that wars end not with treaties, but with stories. And the story she had crafted, of a people who turned grief into strength, of a woman who bent sorrow into a weapon, would outlast any agreement written on foreign soil. The collapse of Saigon in 1975 was inevitable by then. The tanks rolling through its gates were not just steel, they were symbols. Symbols born from the rituals she had orchestrated, from the defiance she had planted decades earlier. And as helicopters lifted desperate Americans from rooftops, the shadow of Nguyen Thi Dinh stretched over the city, invisible yet undeniable, the unarmed commander who had taught the world that belief itself could overthrow empires. The fall of Saigon in 1975 did not mark the end of Nguyen Thi Dinh's war. It marked the beginning of something far more enduring, the age of memory. As the last American helicopters clawed into the sky, her vision had already secured its place in history. Victory was no longer measured in territory, but in permanence. She had etched herself into the bloodstream of a nation, a presence that neither exile nor occupation could erase. In the new Vietnam, she emerged not simply as a commander, but as a living relic of endurance. To the victorious government, she was elevated as a symbol of the people's resilience. The woman who had carried the revolution on her back. Statues were cast in her image, streets named in her honor, children taught to recite her story. Yet beneath the state's ceremonies, her power lived in something deeper, the whispered reverence of women who had fought under her command, who remembered the nights of silence before a march, the coded songs that carried courage through the dark. But her myth carried danger too. For the victors, she was both an asset and a threat. She embodied a form of power that could not be easily controlled, a power born not of ideology, but of belief itself. The government tried to fold her into the official narrative, to tame her memory into neat textbooks. Yet stories continued to circulate beyond their control, tales of her walking through gunfire untouched, of her voice carrying across rivers, of her spirit standing beside the dead. Myths they could not censor. Outside Vietnam, her image was equally untamable. In Latin America, guerrilla movements invoked her as the proof that resistance could outlast empires. In Africa, leaders whispered her name as they trained women to lead their uprisings. In Europe, radicals studied her rituals as case studies in how to fracture power without matching its strength. And in the secret files of Western intelligence agencies, her name lingered like an unsolved equation. They had measured her armies, tracked her movements, mapped her networks, but they could not dissect the force she had wielded. By the 1980s, Nguyen Thi Dinh had become more than a revolutionary. She was a paradox, a woman both celebrated and feared, both honored and mythologized. To some, she was a saint of endurance, to others a phantom of rebellion. But all who spoke of her agreed on one thing. She had rewritten the grammar of war. She had shown that victory belonged not to the side with the most weapons, but to the side with the deepest memory. And in that, she secured something even greater than victory in Vietnam. She secured immortality, not as flesh and blood, but as story, a story that spread wherever the powerless looked for a way to rise. Time, the one adversary even she could not outmaneuver, began to claim its due. By the late 1980s, Nguyen Thi Dinh's body weakened, though her spirit remained unbroken. Years of clandestine marches, sleepless nights in the Delta, and the burden of carrying entire communities within her mind had left her with a frail frame. Yet even as illness crept in, the aura surrounding her only grew stronger. Those who visited her in her final years spoke of a strange duality. She was quiet, gentle even, a grandmother with tired eyes, speaking softly of rice harvests and family. But when her name was uttered outside that room, it carried the weight of empires. For villagers who still told stories of the war, she was not aging. She was eternal. To them, she had never been a single woman at all. She had been a force, grief transformed into resistance, silence transfigured into power. The government staged ceremonies to honor her, wrapping her legacy in banners and speeches. But those who had marched under her command knew the truth. She had never fought for statues or medals. She had fought to teach her people how to endure the unbearable. Her greatest weapon had not been the rifle, nor even the funeral march, but the seed of memory planted in every heart she touched. When she passed in 1992, the nation wept. But the mourning did not feel like an ending. It felt like a continuation, as if her death had only sharpened her myth. Crowds filled the streets not simply to honor her, but to ensure she would not fade into the silence of history. Women carried flowers not as offerings, but as torches. Veterans saluted not the general, but the mother who had carried them when they thought they could not carry themselves. And beyond Vietnam, her passing rippled outward like a secret signal. Liberation movements across continents invoked her memory in their own struggles. Scholars dissected her tactics, writing not of battles won or lost, but of the way she had mastered the theater of belief. Intelligence agencies, even in death, filed reports on the symbolic potency of Nguyen Thi Dinh, warning that her story could continue to inspire insurgencies in places far removed from Southeast Asia. In the end, her body returned to the soil she had fought for, but her myth refused burial. It lived in the rice fields where children still whispered her name, in the rituals of resistance adopted by strangers in lands she had never seen, in the nightmares of powers that still feared what one woman had proven possible. Nguyen Thi Dinh did not just win a war. She rewrote the logic of power itself, and in doing so, she secured a truth no empire dares admit: that a single woman, armed with memory and grief, can fracture the foundations of the mighty and echo through history long after her breath has stilled. Decades after her death, Nguyen Thi Dinh still refuses to rest, not in spirit, not in memory, not in the lessons she carved into history, Her name surfaces in the most unexpected corners of the modern world, whispered in protests, studied in military academies, feared in the corridors of power, because though the war she fought has ended, the battlefield she created never closed. Look closely at the uprisings of our century, and you will see her fingerprints. In Cairo's Tahrir Square, where unarmed crowds faced tanks with nothing but chants and banners. In Caracas, where women draped in mourning garments led marches that the armed forces dared not disperse. In Hong Kong, where silence itself became a form of defiance. None of these movements invoked her name directly, yet each carried her design. The inversion of power, the weaponization of grief, the theater of the impossible turned into the inevitable. Even governments that once dismissed her now study her with dread. Military schools in the West teach her tactics as psychological insurgency. Though they rarely utter her name aloud, they speak of non-linear resistance, of the symbolic front. But those phrases are thin veils for what she mastered long ago, the understanding that power lies not in guns or governments, but in the minds of the people who believe in them. And once belief is broken, no army can hold the field. In villages across Vietnam, her presence is still palpable. Elderly women speak of her as if she has only stepped out for a walk and will return at dusk. Young girls, too young to remember her, grow up with stories of the commander who turned sorrow into a sword. And in every harvest, when the people bend their backs over rice fields, her spirit lingers, a reminder that resilience itself can be revolutionary. But her shadow is not confined to Vietnam. It drifts wherever power presses against the powerless, wherever grief waits to be transfigured into defiance. She is invoked without being named, present without being summoned, a phantom that stalks the imagination of the oppressed and the fears of the oppressor. This is Nguyen Thi Dinh's true victory, not the battle she fought, not even the empire she helped topple, but the architecture of memory she left behind. A design so enduring that it outlives her flesh, outlives her century, and continues to instruct those who dare to challenge the giants of their own age. And perhaps that is the ultimate terror she instills in empires, that they can never kill her, because Nguyen Thi Dinh is no longer a woman. She is a grammar of resistance, a language of defiance, an unbroken echo rolling forward through time. The funeral marches continue. The banners still rise. The silence still terrifies. And somewhere in the mind of a young woman preparing to face impossible odds, Nguyen Thi Dinh whispers across decades, "You do not need permission to resist. You only need memory." The story of Nguyen Thi Dinh is not confined to history books. It is not locked in the jungles of Vietnam, nor buried beneath the rubble of war. It is here now, breathing through every act of defiance that unsettles the powerful. Because what she discovered was not merely a strategy of war, but a law of human spirit that grief, when refused surrender, becomes a force no empire can withstand. You can still see her in the eyes of protesters who lock arms in the face of riot shields, in the chants that shake governments without a single shot fired, in the funerals that turn into marches where the dead walk once more through the living. Every time a crowd stands unarmed before machines of war, Nguyen Thi Dinh is there, not as a ghost, but as a presence that teaches the oppressed how to bend sorrow into steel. And this is why her story terrifies, because she proved that power is fragile, that all it takes is one mind refusing to bow, one community refusing to grieve in silence, one woman who dares to turn memory into a weapon, and empires begin to crack. The question is not whether Nguyen Thi Dinh still lives. The question is whether you can see her, whether you can recognize her shadow in the movements of today, in the whispers of tomorrow, in the silent rebellions forming in the corners of the world. Her war is not over. It never ended. It only changed shape. And if you look closely enough, you will find her standing where grief refuses to be quiet, where fear refuses to be final, where memory refuses to die. Nguyen Thi Dinh did not vanish into history. She became history's pulse. And if you listen closely, you can hear it, steady, unyielding, alive. The question is not if her echo reaches you. The question is, what will you do when it does? History likes to pretend it buries its rebels, that the soil closes over their bodies, that time dilutes their memory, that silence erases their defiance. But some figures refuse burial. They linger in the marrow of generations, not as statues or slogans, but as living instructions. Nguyen Thi Dinh is one of them. Close your eyes, and you can almost hear her voice carried across the centuries. Low, steady, carved from the sorrow of the countless funerals she once turned into battlefields. She does not scream, does not command. She whispers, as if the truth she holds was never meant for the many, only for the few who are listening closely enough. Grief is not the end. Grief is the weapon they fear most. It is the kind of truth that outlives armies, the kind of truth that can be carried from one oppressed soul to another, crossing borders, defying regimes, infecting even those who believe themselves untouchable. And it is the truth that no government, no intelligence agency, no empire has ever been able to silence. So when the world trembles again, when the streets fill with chants, when the powerless stare down the armored vehicles of the powerful, do not think of it as something new. It is not new. It is Nguyen Thi Dinh still walking, still whispering, still teaching. Her shadow moving across time, reminding the forgotten that memory is stronger than bullets. The screen fades, but her echo remains. In the silence that follows, in the breath you are holding, in the pulse you cannot ignore. And somewhere in that silence, you realize that Nguyen Thi Dinh has not left. She has only entered you. You have listened to her story. You have walked through the marches of silence, through the funerals that became banners, through the jungles where memory itself was sharpened into a blade. But now the question presses in. Where does her story end, and where does yours begin? Because Nguyen Thi Dinh is not a tale locked in the past. She is not a ghost recited for fascination. She is a mirror held up to every soul who has ever tasted grief, every human who has ever felt powerless and wondered whether that powerlessness could be broken. When you watched her turn sorrow into defiance, what did you feel? Fear, admiration, a quiet recognition that the same grief sleeps inside you waiting to be awakened. Do not fool yourself into thinking this is distant history. The structures of power she defied still exist. The empires may wear new faces, but their hunger has not changed, and neither has the law she discovered, that the moment the oppressed decide their grief will not be wasted, power begins to tremble. Look around your own world. Look at the movements rising, the marches swelling, the silence that unnerves governments more than any weapon. Do you see it? That is her shadow, alive, moving, multiplying. She has already stepped into your century, and now you must ask, when her echo touches you, will you ignore it? Will you bury it beneath comfort, distraction, fear? Or will you carry it, as countless others have, turning memory into defiance, grief into endurance, and silence into the most dangerous sound of all? Nguyen Thi Dinh is not a figure of Vietnam alone. She is not confined to jungles or to statues. She is wherever power believes it cannot be challenged. She is wherever the weak remember they are not weak at all. She is wherever you choose to see her. Her war is unfinished. Her memory is a command. And the mirror she holds will not turn away until you answer. What will you do when her shadow reaches you? The tale of Nguyen Thi Dinh does not close with her death, nor with the fall of Saigon, nor with the statues and streets that now bear her name. Those are markers, yes, but they are not endings, because endings belong to those who can be contained, and Nguyen Thi Dinh was never containable. She lives in the fractures of empire, in the whispers of protesters who stand unarmed before lines of rifles, in the grief-stricken faces that refuse to bow, that turn funerals into parades of defiance, in the silence that terrifies rulers more than any battlefield ever could. Every time power falters before the weight of belief, her shadow is there, unseen but undeniable. Think of that. Think of the empires that collapsed not because their armies were destroyed, but because their people stopped believing. Think of the rulers who feared not guns, but songs. Think of the governments that trembled at the sight of women walking in silence. That was her gift to history, a blueprint not for destruction, but for endurance, a grammar of resistance written in memory and blood. And here you sit, listening to her story. Do not mistake yourself for a spectator. You are not outside of this, because her echo does not stop with the screen. It moves outward, slipping through the cracks, reaching for those who hear it. Perhaps it has already reached you. Perhaps it is already asking you the same question it has asked of countless others. What will you do with your grief? Will you let it bury you, or will you make it walk? The light fades, the story closes, but her presence does not. Nguyen Thi still walks, not as flesh, not as memory, but as something far more dangerous, an immortal idea, a whisper in the silence, a weapon that cannot be disarmed. And now she is with you.